Outlaw King is a historical epic about a year in the life of Robert the Bruce. But before you watch the film, you probably have questions about the real history behind it. Not the least of which is, how can someone be both an outlaw and a king? The movie follows the true events of the First War of Scottish Independence, but only looks at a single year from 1306 to 1307. But as that's smack in the middle of the war, there's a bit of backstory you'll really need before you watch the film. See, the whole thing was sparked off in 1286 when Alexander III, the King of Scotland, fell off his horse and broke his royal neck. The irony being that he was on his way to visit his lovely new queen to try and produce a male heir, the exact thing which would have prevented the years of civil war that followed. With multiple claimants to the Scottish throne, the Lords of Scotland appealed to their cousins in England to arbitrate, known as the Great Cause. But surprise, it backfired, and the King of England, Edward the Longshanks, seized power for himself, demanding that everyone recognize him as the Lord Paramount of Scotland. Fancy title. This kicks off a series of revolts up and down the Highlands, and leads to the rebellion of William Wallace and the events of the movie Braveheart. But that's the story for another video. Enter Robert the Bruce, son of an Anglo-Norman lord and a Gaelic mother, well-educated and well-read for the time, and likely trilingual. And that's important because it blurs the border between Scotland and England and shows just how interconnected the two were. But the Bruce's belief in his family's right to the throne was absolute, and they alternately backed the English or the Scottish depending on who they felt would best advance their claim at the time. The biggest obstacle was in fact other Scottish lords, specifically John Comyn, a powerful noble who had been more resolute in his opposition of England and had an equally good claim on the throne. Stories tell that Comyn was just as desperate to try and claim the throne, and even tried to sell out Robert to England. But when it failed, he agreed to a meeting with the Bruce at the chapel of Greyfriars Monastery in Dumfries, possibly to try and bury the hatchet. But at the end of the meeting, John Comyn found a hatchet buried in his own skull. Whether or not this was just straight murder or Robert was provoked is a matter for contention, but it was the exact excuse the King of England needed to get rid of the Scottish upstart. He wrote to the Pope and had Robert excommunicated, and followed it up by making him an outlaw for good measure. And that's where the movie Outlaw King picks up. Being an outlaw is a bit of an odd term to modern audiences. It literally meant that a person was outside the protection of the legal system. But in practice, they were banned from all civilized society, and no one was allowed to give them food, shelter, or support of any kind, or else they too would be punished. But regardless of all this, 6 weeks after Comyn's murder, the Bruce is crowned as the King of Scotland on the 25th of March in Anno Domini 1306. And he takes up the royal banner of Scottish kings, a red lion rampant on a yellow field. Coronation aside, Robert's new throne was hardly secure. His wife, Elizabeth de Burgh, the daughter of the Earl of Ulster and now Queen of Scots, remarked that it seems to me we are to be a summer king and queen, whom children crown in their sport. And she had a point. I mean, it costs nothing to crown someone, but the land itself would have to be one with blood and iron. In the movie, the King of England then sends his son, the future Edward II, to deal with the situation. But in reality, the Scottish expedition was headed by Aymer de Valence, Earl of Pembroke. And it's an interesting historic footnote that Valence was also the Bruce's second cousin, and it's also a nice reminder of just how closely English and Scottish aristocracy were actually related at the time. By the middle of the summer, the English had set up base at Perth, where Valence's army was joined by the supporters of the now-deceased John Comyn, because the Scots know how to keep a grudge. Robert raised his own army of Scotland and approached from the west, and surrounded the castle of Perth. And according to tradition, the Bruce invited Valence to leave the walls and meet them in honorable battle in an agreed-upon site. Valence refused. The Bruce's challenge to a fair fight really rings of heroic embellishment. And probably shouldn't be decided as good history, but his decision not to besiege the castle was actually a sound one, even though it had disastrous consequences. Staying at Perth meant a really high risk of disease outbreak, and being immobile in a time when the Bruce really needed to be traveling around Scotland pressing his claim. Regardless of his reasons, sources recorded that the Bruce believed Valence's forces were too small to be a threat, and so he retired 5 miles away to the nearby town of Methven. And he thought so little of the English that he didn't even bother to set up pickets or even place sentries. And this naivete would cost him dearly. Sometime before dawn on the 19th of June, Valence led his forces out from the castle in the middle of the night. It marched through the dim Scottish summer gloom and swept down on the unsuspecting Bruce. As I've mentioned elsewhere, the movie's fire arrows are an unlikely weapon for the battle. I mean, Valence's weapon of choice would have been the premier crack English cavalry, and a lot of torches. But it is possible they softened up with Scots with a few volleys before charging in. The results, though, were the same. The entire Scottish army fled in panic, and was almost completely destroyed on the spot. Some 4,500 Scotsmen beaten by 3,000 Englishmen, without even a fight. What was left of the Bruce's army then escaped with him further west towards the mountains of Argyll, only to run into Clan MacDougall, English allies and, surprise, old supporters of John Comyn. The Battle of Dalry was a fight of desperate men. It was everything Robert the Bruce could do to disengage and get himself out alive. The Bruce even found himself driven into a ravine, fighting man to man, so hard pressed that one warrior of Clan MacDougall reached out and ripped a studded brooch from his cloak, which somehow still survives today and is known as the Brooch of Lorne. Sure, the Bruce fought the MacDougalls off, but within days, his army ceased to be an organized military force, and Robert was again forced to wander Scotland. And it's at this point that the Bruce then sort of disappears from history, and doesn't reappear again until the spring of 1307. And it's actually this lost year that the bulk of the movie Outlaw King covers. So much so that 20 minutes was actually cut from the film to get to its final act faster. You know, the part where he comes back and kicks some serious butt. But the English didn't exactly make it easy for him. When Robert the Bruce was away, they imprisoned his wife and daughter, captured his sisters, and then hung them from cages at Roxburgh and Berwick castles. And then, just in case you were worried the English were going too easy on the Bruce, they had his brother Neil hanged, drawn, and quartered. You know, the traditional fate of anyone attempting high treason. So by the time he reappears in the spring of 1307, Robert the Bruce is rearing for a fight. He landed in the southwest of Scotland and began raiding around Ayrshire and Galloway, doing his best to show he meant serious business and draw new men to his banner, using hit-and-run raids to destroy crops, castles, and generally being a nuisance to the English. The Battle of Glentrool, which was really no more than a skirmish against the English, does the trick of convincing the locals to join him. But it also gets the attention of Emir de Valence again, whose army of 3,000 Englishmen vastly outnumbered the Bruce's new 600. But knowing that Valence was coming for him, the Bruce picked out an open field with boggy ground on each side. To negate the English numerical advantage, the Scots then dug ditches that funneled the English in even further, and then they set up a nice wall of pikes to meet their cavalry. And this is the big final battle of the film. Big, bloody, and surprisingly accurate. Even with everything going according to plan, though, it was still a close-fought thing. And in the history of Robert the Bruce, the Battle of Loudon Hill, the film's finale, is relatively minor, but it was an important step in setting him on his road to ultimate victory. And it also does a great job of setting up any future sequels, as rumors suggest that Outlaw King may in fact be the first in a trilogy of films that follow the further exploits of the Bruce. So when you pull up Netflix on November 9th, don't be surprised by the burly chainmail-clad Chris Pine that greets you. Instead, take 2 hours and enjoy the first part of the story of one of history's greatest heroes. I know I will. Thanks for watching.